Betrayed by his own children and homeless at 77, Henry Caldwell was sleeping in an old pickup truck with just 186 hours left to his name. Then, a mysterious inheritance changed everything. A distant relative had left him a mountain cabin in Wyoming, a place his children mocked as worthless. But beneath its stone floor, Henry discovered a hidden vault, holding a $268 million fortune. And suddenly, the children who threw him away wanted their father back. So, stay with me, because what happened next wasn't just about money. It was about family, betrayal, and one old man finally standing up for himself. The coldest night of Henry Caldwell's life wasn't the night the temperature dropped below 20 degrees. It was the night he realized none of his children wanted him anymore. At 77, Henry sat behind the wheel of a rusted Ford F-150 in a church parking lot outside Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. The engine had been off for hours to save gas. Frost crept across the windshield while he pulled an old moving blanket tighter around his shoulders. On the passenger seat sat everything he had left: one small suitcase, a worn Bible, and a photograph of his wife, Evelyn. Henry had not always been homeless. For 46 years, he had been a carpenter, the kind of man who could walk onto an empty lot in the morning and already imagine the family that would someday live there. His hands had built hundreds of walls, porches, staircases, and kitchen tables. Those same hands had raised 3 children: Ryan, Grace, and Dylan. Henry worked weekends when school tuition was due. He skipped vacations when braces had to be paid for. When one child needed a car, he found the money. When another fell behind on a mortgage, Henry helped again. He never kept score. Evelyn sometimes worried that he gave too much. "They have to learn to stand on their own someday, Henry," she once told him. Henry had smiled. There are children, Evie. That's what fathers do. Then Evelyn died after 53 years of marriage, and the house became unbearably quiet. 6 months later, Ryan convinced Henry to sell it. "Come live with us, Dad," his son told him. "Your family. You'll always have a home with me." Henry believed him. He sold the house where he and Evelyn had raised their children, and over the following year, nearly all the money disappeared into one family emergency after another. Grace needed help with her mortgage. Dylan needed money to save his struggling business. Ryan had debts he promised to repay. Henry kept giving, until there was almost nothing left. That was when Ryan stopped calling him Dad with warmth in his voice. That was when conversations became arguments. And one December afternoon, Henry came downstairs to find his suitcase sitting beside the front door. Ryan wouldn't look him in the eyes. "We can't keep carrying you," he said. "You need to find somewhere else to live." Henry stared at his son for a long moment. He wanted to remind Ryan of everything. The Little League games, the college bills, the nights Henry had sat beside his bed when he was sick, the countless times a frightened young man had called his father because he didn't know what to do. But Henry said nothing, because somewhere inside him, something had finally broken. He picked up his suitcase and walked outside. That night, with only 180 scissors left to his name, Henry slept in his truck. Before closing his eyes, he picked up Evelyn's photograph. She was smiling at him from another lifetime. Henry touched her face with one trembling finger. "I should have listened to you, Evie," he whispered. For the first time in 77 years, Henry had nowhere to go. And yet, somewhere more than 1,000 miles away in the Wyoming mountains, an old cabin was waiting for him. So was a letter. And beneath the floor of that cabin was a secret that had remained hidden for decades. Henry thought his life was ending. He didn't know it yet. But it was about to begin again, For the next 3 weeks, Henry Caldwell lived inside his truck. He learned which church parking lots allowed overnight parking and which gas stations had restrooms that stayed open after midnight. He learned that a cup of coffee could buy him 2 hours of warmth in a diner if he drank it slowly enough. Most of all, he learned how invisible an old man could become. People walked past his Ford without looking inside. Some mornings, Henry woke before sunrise simply because the cold became too painful to sleep through. His fingers ached with arthritis, and his back protested every time he tried to straighten it. Still, he refused to call his children. He had their numbers. He just didn't have anything left to ask them for. Every night, before trying to sleep, Henry looked at Evelyn's photograph. "Don't worry about me, Evie," he'd whisper. "I'll figure something out." He wasn't sure he believed it. Then, on a bitter Tuesday morning, something changed. Henry woke to the sound of wind pushing against the truck. Frost covered the windshield, and his breath hung in the air. He reached for the door handle, climbed stiffly outside, and noticed something beneath the driver's side windshield wiper. An envelope. Not a flyer. Not a parking ticket. A thick, cream-colored envelope with his full name written across the front. Henry Caldwell. He stared at it. Almost nobody knew where he was sleeping. Henry pulled the envelope free and climbed back into the truck. In the corner was the name of a law firm in Sheridan, Wyoming. His first thought was that somebody had made a mistake. His second was that maybe one of his children had gotten him involved in another financial problem. He opened it anyway. The letter was short. A man named Samuel Caldwell had died at 91. Henry remembered the name. Barely. Samuel had been a distant relative on his father's side, a quiet man Henry had met only a handful of times decades earlier. He remembered him standing alone at a family funeral. He remembered a firm handshake at a reunion. That was about it. But according to the letter, Samuel had left Henry something in his will. A property in northern Wyoming, 58 acres of mountain land, and an old cabin. Henry read the letter twice. Then a third time. There was no mortgage, no outstanding debt. The property belonged to him if he chose to accept it. Samuel had even left money to cover Henry's travel expenses. At the bottom was a telephone number. Henry sat motionless. 20 minutes later, he finally called. An attorney named Benjamin Cole answered. "Yes, Mr. Caldwell," Benjamin said after Henry introduced himself. "I've been hoping you'd call." Henry swallowed. "Why me?" There was a brief silence. Samuel was very specific about that. "What did he say?" Benjamin hesitated. "He said you'd understand after you saw the place." That answer stayed with Henry. The lawyer warned him that the cabin was remote. The nearest town was miles away. Winters could be brutal, and the property hadn't been modernized like a vacation home. Henry almost laughed. After sleeping in a truck, 4 walls and a roof sounded like luxury. "I'd like to see it," he said. For the first time in weeks, Henry had somewhere to go. But he made one mistake. He told his children. Maybe some part of him still hoped they would be happy for him. Ryan laughed. "A cabin in Wyoming. Dad, you're 77. What are you going to do, become a mountain man?" Grace was more calculating. "What's the land worth?" "I don't know." "You should sell it." Then Dylan called. "Dad, don't sign anything until I look at the paperwork. There are people who take advantage of elderly people with inheritance scams." Henry almost appreciated the concern, until Dylan added, "You could sign power of attorney over to me. I'll handle everything." Henry went silent. There it was again. Not, "Are you okay?" Not, Do you have somewhere warm to sleep? Not Dad, come home. Just, what is it worth? Sell it. Give me control. Henry looked through the windshield at the church parking lot where he'd spent another freezing night. Something inside him hardened. No, he said. Dylan paused. What? I said no. It was perhaps the smallest word Henry had ever spoken. But after a lifetime of giving, it felt enormous. 2 days later, Henry pointed his old Ford west. The lawyer had wired enough money for gas, food, and several nights in inexpensive motels. Henry packed his suitcase, placed Evelyn's photograph carefully on the passenger seat, and began driving toward Wyoming. Pennsylvania disappeared behind him. Then Ohio, Indiana, Illinois. The farther west he traveled, the wider the sky became. For the first time since Evelyn died, Henry felt something other than grief. He felt curious, then hopeful. Several days later, the mountains finally appeared on the horizon. Snow covered their peaks. Pine forest stretched beneath them, dark and endless. Henry pulled onto the shoulder. He stared for a long time. Then he looked at Evelyn's photograph. Well, Evie, he whispered, smiling through wet eyes. Looks like the old man still has somewhere to go. What Henry didn't know was that Samuel hadn't simply left him a place to live. The old cabin waiting in those mountains had been keeping a secret for decades. And once Henry found it, the same children who had thrown him away would suddenly remember exactly where their father was. Henry reached the cabin just before sunset. It stood alone among towering pines. A 2-story structure of dark timber and stone with snow gathering along the edges of its metal roof. It wasn't beautiful in the way expensive homes were beautiful, but to Henry, it was perfect. It had walls. It had a fireplace. And, most importantly, nobody could tell him to leave. For the first few days, Henry did little more than settle in. He repaired a loose porch railing, cleaned the chimney, and found an old workbench filled with Samuel's tools. Holding a carpenter's plane again awakened something inside him. But Henry had spent 46 years building houses, and soon he noticed something strange. The measurements didn't make sense. The northern wall appeared almost 6 feet shorter inside than it should have been. Several floorboards near the massive stone fireplace produced a hollow sound beneath his boots. One evening, Henry knelt beside the hearth and examined the stonework. "Samuel," he murmured, "what were you building here?" His fingers moved across the stones until they found a small depression hidden inside a carved wooden panel. Henry pressed it. Click. A low grinding sound came from beneath the floor. Henry froze. Then a section of flooring beside the fireplace shifted slightly upward. His heart began pounding. Using an iron poker, Henry carefully lifted the panel. Beneath it was darkness and stone steps. He grabbed a flashlight and descended slowly. 12 steps later, his boots touched a stone floor. Henry raised the light and stopped breathing. The underground chamber stretched beneath much of the cabin. Wooden crates lined the walls. Shelves held leather-bound books, boxes of coins, documents, and carefully wrapped objects. Paintings rested inside climate-protected cases. In one corner stood several small bars of gold. At the center was an oak desk. On it sat a leather journal. Henry opened it. Samuel had documented everything. Paintings purchased at estate sales decades earlier. Rare books. Historic manuscripts. Gold and collectible coins. Stocks bought when companies were still young. Bonds that had quietly accumulated value for decades. Henry's hands began trembling as he turned the pages. Then he reached the final accounting. Fine art and sculpture $76.4 million. Rare books and historical documents, $21.8 million. Precious metals and coins, $39.6 million. Stocks, bonds, and other investments, $118.7 million. Other collectibles and assets, $11.5 million. Henry added the figures twice because his mind refused to accept the answer. $268 million? He slowly lowered himself into Samuel's chair. 3 weeks earlier, he'd been sleeping in a freezing pickup truck with 186. Now he was sitting above a fortune larger than anything he could comprehend. But then Henry noticed something tucked inside the back cover of the journal. An envelope. On the front were 3 handwritten words. For Henry Caldwell. He opened it. Samuel's message was brief. Henry, if you found this, then you found what I spent most of my life protecting. I didn't choose you because you needed money. I chose you because I watched you spend your life giving. Then came the sentence that broke Henry. You built homes for everyone else, only to have your own family take yours away. Henry covered his mouth. His eyes filled with tears. Samuel had known. Somehow he had known. The final line read, Now, build a life no one can ever take from you. Henry sat alone beneath the cabin and wept. Not because he was suddenly worth $268 million, but because after being treated like a burden by his own children, someone had finally reminded him that he still had value. Above him, snow fell silently over the Wyoming mountains, and hundreds of miles away, 3 people who had abandoned their father had no idea their lives were about to change too. Because secrets worth $268 million don't stay secret forever. And when Henry's children discovered what was beneath that cabin, they wouldn't be laughing anymore. Henry didn't sleep that night. He sat at Samuel's oak desk beneath the cabin, surrounded by more wealth than he could comprehend, reading the old man's journals until the batteries in his flashlight began to weaken. Page after page revealed a life Henry had never known. Samuel had lived simply, almost invisibly. He bought things other people overlooked, invested patiently, and waited decades while their value grew. But what affected Henry most wasn't the money. It was Samuel's observations about him. One entry described a family reunion nearly 30 years earlier. Samuel had watched Henry quietly slip money into the pocket of a struggling relative who was too proud to ask for help. Another recalled Henry caring for Evelyn after an illness while still working 10-hour days. And then Henry found a sentence underlined twice. Henry gives because he believes love means taking care of people. I only hope the people he loves never mistake his kindness for weakness. Henry closed the journal. For years, he had blamed himself. Maybe he hadn't been generous enough. Maybe he'd become difficult after Evelyn died. Maybe Ryan really had needed the space. Maybe Grace and Dylan had problems of their own. There was always another excuse. But sitting in that vault, Henry finally saw the truth. He had loved his children. They had learned to use that love. And there was a difference. The next morning, Henry called Benjamin Cole. The attorney arrived at the cabin before noon. Henry led him downstairs and watched the man's face change as he saw the crates, documents, paintings, and financial records. "My God," Benjamin whispered. Henry handed him Samuel's ledger. "Is it real?" Benjamin spent several minutes reading before looking up. "If these records are accurate, Henry, you need serious legal protection immediately." "From who?" Benjamin hesitated. Henry already knew the answer. Everyone. Over the following days, specialists arrived quietly. An estate attorney, a financial advisor, 2 independent appraisers. They confirmed what Samuel's records suggested: the collection and investments were extraordinary, and Henry was their lawful beneficiary. Benjamin helped establish a trust designed to protect the assets. Henry listened carefully during every meeting. For most of his life, he'd let other people tell him what was best for him. Not anymore. Then, one afternoon, his phone rang. Ryan. Henry stared at the name before answering. Hello? His son's voice sounded different. Warm. Almost cheerful. Dad, how are you doing out there? Henry said nothing for a moment. Ryan hadn't asked how he was doing when Henry was sleeping in his truck. I'm fine. That's good. That's really good. Another pause. Then came the real question. So, I heard Samuel left you more than just the cabin. Henry's grip tightened around the phone. Where did you hear that? Doesn't matter. Grace heard something about appraisers coming up there. Dylan did some digging. Of course he did. Ryan lowered his voice. Dad, if there's money involved, you shouldn't handle this alone. We're family. We should make these decisions together. Henry looked around Samuel's cabin. He remembered the suitcase beside Ryan's front door. The freezing nights in the Ford. The words that had followed him west. We can't keep carrying you. Henry felt no anger this time. Only clarity. Ryan. Yeah, Dad. 3 weeks ago, I was homeless. Silence. You knew that. Dad, come on. You knew I was sleeping in my truck, and you never called to ask whether I was warm. Ryan tried to interrupt. Henry continued. Now, you hear there might be money, and suddenly we're family again. That's not fair. Henry almost smiled. No, son, what happened to me wasn't fair. Then Henry said something he never imagined he would have the strength to say. You told me to find somewhere else to live. He looked through the window at the snow-covered mountains. I did, and he ended the call. Henry stood there for a long time afterward. His hands were shaking, but not from fear. For the first time since Evelyn died, he wasn't desperately trying to keep his family from leaving him. He understood something now. Sometimes losing people isn't the tragedy. Sometimes the tragedy is losing yourself while begging them to stay. And hundreds of miles away, Ryan was already calling Grace and Dylan. Because Henry's children had finally realized the worthless mountain cabin wasn't worthless at all. And this time, they weren't coming to rescue their father. They were coming for his inheritance, 3 days after Ryan's call. Henry heard engines climbing the narrow mountain road. He was repairing a loose board on the front porch when the first vehicle appeared between the pines. A black SUV. Then another. Henry slowly set down his hammer. He already knew. Ryan stepped out first, wearing a wool coat that probably cost more than Henry's old truck. Grace emerged from the second vehicle, followed by Dylan. But they weren't alone. A tall man in a dark suit climbed out behind them, carrying a leather briefcase. Henry stared at him. Of course. They had brought a lawyer. For weeks, none of Henry's children had been willing to give their homeless father a bedroom. Now, all three had traveled more than 1,000 miles to visit him. Henry almost admired the irony. Ryan walked toward the porch wearing the same smile he'd used as a boy whenever he wanted something. Dad. Henry remained seated. What are you doing here? Grace stepped forward. We came because we're worried about you. Henry looked at her. Were you worried when I was sleeping in my truck? Grace's smile disappeared. Dylan sighed. Dad, can we not do this? We came all this way. No one asked you to. The lawyer finally stepped forward. Mr. Caldwell, my name is Adrian Foster. Your children asked me to help the family understand the legal situation surrounding Samuel Caldwell's estate. Henry looked at Ryan. The family. Ryan's patience was already fading. "Dad, we're your children. Whatever Samuel left you will eventually come to us anyway. We're just trying to make sure it's managed properly." There it was. Not an apology. Not regret. Not even shame. Just ownership. Henry rose slowly. His knees hurt in the cold, but he stood straight. "How much do you think I inherited?" Nobody answered. Henry looked at each of them. "That's why you're here, isn't it?" Grace finally spoke. "We've heard it could be millions. And if it were $5,000. Silence. "If Samuel left me nothing but this cabin and 58 acres of trees, would you still be standing here?" Ryan's face hardened. "This isn't about that." "Yes," Henry said quietly. "It is." The lawyer opened his briefcase. "Mr. Caldwell, given your age and the potential size of this estate, your children have legitimate concerns about whether you're equipped to manage complicated financial assets." Henry almost laughed. At 77, the same man who had spent 46 years measuring twice before cutting once was apparently too old to understand ownership. "And what exactly are you suggesting?" "A family trust," Adrian replied. "Your children could assist with management. It would remove a tremendous burden from you." That word, burden. Henry looked at Ryan. Only weeks earlier, Henry himself had been the burden. Now, $268 million had become one. Ryan stepped closer. "We can fix this, Dad, all of it. You can come home, we'll make room." For just a second, Henry felt the old instinct return. The father in him wanted to believe those words. He remembered Ryan at 6 years old asleep against his chest. Grace running toward him after her first school play. Dylan sitting beside him in the garage, trying to hold a hammer with 2 tiny hands. Henry still loved them. That was what made everything hurt so much. But love didn't require blindness. "No," Henry said. Ryan stared at him. "What?" "I already found a home." Henry turned toward the cabin. "And I've already established a trust." The lawyer's expression changed. "The estate is protected." Henry continued. "I have attorneys, appraisers, financial advisors. Nothing can be transferred without the safeguards Samuel intended." Ryan's face reddened. "You did all that without talking to us." Henry looked directly into his son's eyes. "You taught me I needed to take care of myself." The words landed harder than shouting ever could. Grace began crying. Dylan looked away. But Ryan's sadness became anger. "You owe us, Dad." Henry's face changed. After everything he'd given them, those 4 words finally killed whatever guilt remained inside him. "No, Ryan." His voice was calm. "I gave you my time, my savings, my home. I gave you 40 years of a father's love without asking for anything back." He paused. "And when I had nothing left, you gave me a suitcase." Nobody spoke. Henry stepped toward the door. "You wanted me to stop being your burden." He looked at his children one final time. "Consider your wish granted." Then he walked inside and closed the door. But Ryan wasn't finished. By sunset, Henry would learn that his children hadn't driven to Wyoming simply to negotiate. They had already prepared their next move. And this time, they weren't asking for Henry's money. They were preparing to convince a court that their 77-year-old father was no longer capable of controlling it. The papers arrived the next morning. Henry was drinking coffee at Samuel's old kitchen table when a sheriff's deputy pulled into the clearing. The man removed his hat before approaching the porch, almost as if he were embarrassed by what he had come to deliver. "Mr. Caldwell." "Yes." "I'm sorry, sir. These are for you." Henry took the thick envelope. His children were petitioning the court for emergency guardianship. Ryan, Grace, and Dylan claimed their father was emotionally unstable after Evelyn's death, vulnerable because of his age, and incapable of responsibly managing an estate worth hundreds of millions of dollars. They wanted the court to appoint someone to make decisions for him, someone they could influence. Henry read the petition twice. Then he noticed one sentence. Mr. Caldwell has recently experienced homelessness, demonstrating an inability to provide for his own basic needs. Henry stopped reading. Homelessness. They were using it against him. The same children who had watched him lose his home were now presenting his suffering as proof that he couldn't take care of himself. His hands began trembling. For a moment, Henry was that frightened old man in the church parking lot again. Maybe fighting them would cost too much. Maybe he should give them something and make this disappear. That was what Henry had always done. Give. Compromise. Keep the peace. Then his eyes drifted toward Evelyn's photograph on the mantel, and he remembered something she had told him years ago. Henry, kindness without boundaries eventually becomes permission. He slowly folded the petition. No more, he whispered. That afternoon, Benjamin Cole returned with an estate attorney and a lawyer experienced in elder financial abuse. For the next several days, Henry did something his children had never expected. He fought back. Not with anger, with evidence. Bank records showed the money he'd given Ryan. Canceled checks documented Grace's mortgage payments. Wire transfers revealed the money sent to Dylan's failing business. Then came the messages. Henry had never deleted them. There were dozens. Dad, I really need your help. Just this once. I'll pay you back. You're the only person I can count on. And finally, Ryan's last message. We can't keep carrying you. You need to find somewhere else to live. Henry stared at those words. His attorney looked at him. Do you understand what this shows? Henry nodded. They didn't become concerned about me until I became rich. Exactly. Henry underwent independent medical and cognitive evaluations. The results were unmistakable. At 77, his body carried the marks of age, arthritis, an old shoulder injury. Slower movement, but his mind remained clear. One evaluator even asked Henry why he hadn't pursued legal action against his children earlier. Henry thought for a moment. Because they're my children. Then he added quietly, and I confused forgiving them with letting them keep hurting me. That realization changed something inside him. Henry no longer wanted revenge. He didn't want Ryan homeless. He didn't want Grace humiliated. He didn't want Dylan destroyed. He simply wanted them to understand that loving their father did not give them ownership of him. 2 weeks later, Henry walked into the county courthouse. Ryan and Grace were already there. Dylan stood near their attorney. For the first time, Henry didn't lower his eyes. Ryan approached him. We can still settle this. Henry looked at his son. You mean I can still pay you to stop? Ryan's jaw tightened. That's not what I said. You didn't have to. Henry walked past him. During the hearing, the children's attorney described Henry as vulnerable, isolated, grieving, and financially inexperienced. Then Henry's attorney presented the records. Years of financial support, the sale of Henry's home, the transfers to his children, the messages, and finally, the timeline. When Henry had 186, nobody sought guardianship. Nobody questioned his mental health. Nobody rushed to Wyoming to protect him. Only after the discovery of $268 million did his children suddenly become concerned. The courtroom fell silent. Henry looked across the room at the 3 people he'd once carried in his arms. He still loved them, Perhaps he always would. But for the first time, he understood that he could love them without surrendering himself to them. Henry Caldwell had spent 77 years believing a good father should sacrifice everything for his children. Now he understood the part nobody had ever taught him. A good man can have a generous heart and still know when to close the door. And before that hearing was over, one of Henry's children would finally break ranks and reveal something about the family that no one in that courtroom was prepared to hear. The courtroom remained silent. Henry sat beside his attorney, hands folded in his lap, while the judge reviewed the final documents. Then Dylan stood. Henry's youngest son looked pale. "Your Honor," he said quietly, "there's something I need to say." Ryan immediately turned toward him. "Sit down." But Dylan didn't. His voice trembled. "My father isn't confused, he isn't incompetent, and nobody manipulated him." Grace lowered her eyes. Dylan swallowed hard. "We did." Henry stared at his son. "We took his money whenever we needed it. He always said yes because he loved us. And when there wasn't anything left..." Dylan's voice cracked. "We treated him like he wasn't useful anymore." Ryan whispered angrily, "Dylan, stop!" But Dylan continued, "When Dad was sleeping in his truck, I knew..." Henry felt his chest tighten. "I knew," Dylan repeated, "and I didn't bring him home." Tears filled his eyes. "Then we heard about the inheritance, and suddenly we were worried about him." No one moved. Dylan looked directly at Henry. "I'm sorry, Dad." Henry wanted to say something. He couldn't. The judge dismissed the guardianship petition that afternoon. Henry remained in full control of Samuel's estate. But walking down the courthouse steps, he didn't feel victorious. There was no joy in defeating your own children, only sadness that the battle had ever been necessary. Dylan approached him outside. "I don't expect you to forgive me." Henry studied his son's face. "You're still my son." Dylan began to cry. But forgiveness and trust aren't the same thing. Henry placed a hand on his shoulder. "Trust has to be built again." Then Henry walked away. Over the following months, his life changed, but not in the way people expected. He didn't buy a mansion. He didn't replace his old Ford with a luxury car. Instead, he restored Samuel's cabin. Beside it, Henry built a woodworking shop. The first morning he stepped inside. Sunlight poured through the windows onto rows of new tools. Henry ran one weathered hand across the workbench. For the first time since Evelyn died, he smiled without forcing it. But Samuel's words stayed with him. "Now build a life no one can ever take from you." Henry realized he wanted to build more than his own life. He established the Evelyn Caldwell Second Chance Foundation, named after the woman who had spent 53 years beside him. Its purpose was simple: help elderly people who had been abandoned, financially exploited, or left without safe housing. The foundation provided temporary homes, legal assistance, financial counseling, and something Henry understood mattered just as much: someone who would listen. Months later, Henry stood outside the first small house the foundation had completed. Beside him was an 81-year-old widower named Jack who had been sleeping in his car after losing his home. Henry placed a key in the man's hand. Jack stared at it. "This is mine. As long as you need it." The old man's hands began shaking. Then he cried. Henry did too. For a moment, Henry remembered that freezing church parking lot, the moving blanket, the frost on his windshield, Evelyn's photograph on the passenger seat, and 186 in his pocket. He realized something then. Samuel hadn't simply left him $268 million. He had given Henry the chance to turn his deepest wound into someone else's shelter. That evening, Henry returned to the mountain cabin. He sat alone on the porch as the sun disappeared behind the Wyoming peaks. Evelyn's photograph rested beside him. "You were right, Evie," he whispered. "I couldn't save everybody." He looked toward the new workshop, then toward the valley below, where the foundation would soon build more homes. "But maybe I can help a few." The wind moved gently through the pines. Henry smiled. At 77, after losing his wife, his home, his savings, and nearly his faith and family, Henry Caldwell had finally understood something. A second chance doesn't always give you back what you lost. Sometimes it gives you the opportunity to make sure someone else doesn't have to lose what you did. And the man who once slept homeless in a pickup truck was building homes again. Only this time, he was building them for people the world had forgotten. Henry Caldwell spent most of his life believing that love meant giving without limits. He gave his children his time, his strength, his savings, and eventually, even the home he had spent decades building. But when Henry had nothing left to give, he learned one of life's most painful lessons. Some people don't recognize your value until they believe there's something they can gain from you. At 77, homeless and sleeping inside an old pickup truck, Henry could have believed his life was over. Instead, losing everything taught him something 268 million never could. Kindness does not mean allowing yourself to be used. Forgiveness does not require surrendering your dignity. And loving your family does not mean accepting betrayal simply because you share the same blood. Henry's greatest inheritance wasn't hidden beneath Samuel's cabin. It wasn't the paintings, the gold, the investments, or the millions of dollars. It was the chance to understand that his life still had purpose. And perhaps that's the lesson worth remembering. No matter how old you are, no matter how much you've lost, and no matter who walked away when you needed them most, your story does not have to end where they abandoned you. Sometimes that is exactly where your next chapter begins. If Henry's story touched your heart, like this video, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear this today. And tell us in the comments, would you have forgiven Henry's children?